Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thank you so much for joining me for another video. Today we are talking about the reasons why I wouldn't move to Canada. I have lived in Ottawa, Ontario, as well as Calgary, Alberta, and I'm gonna give you my honest opinion, especially from the point of view, or I'm gonna try and do this from the point of view of someone who has not been born here and who hasn't lived here before, to give you guys as much information as possible if you're considering moving here. I have done videos like this before. When I lived in New Zealand, I made a few videos about why I wouldn't live there long term. So I feel like it's only fair that I do this for my own home country. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So the number one reason, the first point, is winter. Winter can be really, really harsh in Canada. In certain parts of Canada, it can last around 6 months of the year. And if you're not used to that, if you're not used to the cold, if you're coming from a country that is typically warmer, it's gonna be a real shock. For me, I actually really love winter, especially the first snowfall. It's always so magical. And there are a lot of parts of winter that I really do enjoy, but it's the length of winter for me that is a huge deal breaker. And again, if you aren't from a really cold weather country, this is going to be a huge shock. If you're coming somewhere like Calgary, Alberta, or even Edmonton, the winters can be very cold and very long. Now, Western Canada, areas like Vancouver, or even Eastern Canada, sometimes Ottawa has a pretty decent winter. It does get very cold and snowy, but it doesn't last as long, like 6 months, like it does in Calgary sometimes. So this can definitely vary, but it gets freezing cold in the vast majority of Canada. You're gonna have to get cold weather gear like boots, hats, mitts, coats. You're gonna have to get winter tires for your vehicle. You might have issues even starting your car in the winter. Heating is quite expensive during the winter because you have to obviously turn it on where you don't need it in the summer. So there are just a ton of aspects when it comes to winter that I think is a deal breaker for a lot of people to moving to Canada at all. It can be a very hard adjustment, but there are some bonuses. I mean, it's not all bad. Winter is not the worst thing in the world for a lot of people. If you're a skier or a snowboarder, or you just like doing outdoor winter sports, it can be a really amazing place for that. So it's something to consider, but I think if I was not from Canada and not born and raised in the cold, it would be a huge downside, and it would definitely be one of the reasons why I would not want to live here long term. Sometimes I even think about it now being a reason why I wouldn't want to live here myself. So I think it's a valid point. The second item on this list is cost of living. And I touched on this in my New Zealand video and reasons why I wouldn't move there. At that time, it was a lot cheaper to live in Canada before this crazy inflation happened. Now moving back here in the last 4 months, I've noticed groceries and rent, particularly in Calgary, have just skyrocketed. The price of groceries blows my mind. Like every time I go grocery shopping, I pretty much never buy anything that's not on sale, but the sale price now is equivalent to like the regular price that items were before I moved away like a couple of years ago. So very disappointing to see that. In Calgary specifically, I have seen rent starting to trend downwards, which is really good. But there's just been so much immigration to Canada in the last year. And Calgary has seen a pretty big influx of people. Around like, I think 96,000 people have moved here. So that's gonna drive the price up. But cost of living was always a really big bonus to living in Calgary because the cost of living here was so much less than Toronto, Vancouver, and similar cities. But now it's getting to the point where spending a little bit more to live in a more bustling city, and a city like Vancouver that has a much easier winter, it just doesn't seem as attractive to be in Calgary anymore. But honestly, across the entire country, we've seen crazy inflation on things like groceries and rent. So it's tough. It is really tough to live in this country right now because nothing's really being done to prevent these grocery store chains or these landlords from just jacking the price up like crazy. I've also heard that car insurance is crazy expensive if you're not from Canada, if you're an immigrant. I've met a couple of people who are paying over $400 per month in insurance for like the basic level of insurance. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. I personally have never paid more than like $140 a month. And I did a quote online really recently and got a quote for $120 a month. So I think this is really specific to people who are immigrants who are not from Canada. Even if you're here on like a working holiday visa, you can expect to pay a crazy amount of money in car insurance if you're gonna go that route, which we're gonna talk about vehicles in a little bit, but car insurance is crazy expensive, groceries and rent It's just not cheap to live in Canada, and the wages aren't necessarily keeping up with that. So it's definitely a downside. The third item on this list is the work is life mentality, or the North American work ethic. I find here that employers are going to expect you to put work first. They're going to expect you to put work ahead of your family, ahead of your friends, your health. I mean, before COVID, people expected you to be in the office if you had a cold. I used to go into the office sick all the time because it just was so frowned upon to take a sick day. Even when you take vacation days, sometimes you can feel like this pressure or this shame of even doing that, which is so incredibly toxic. Typically, you can't take off more than 2 weeks in a row at a time. Even if you have like 4 to 6 weeks of vacation, if you've been with a company a long time, you're gonna find it hard to take more than 2 weeks off in one go. So if you wanted to like go to Europe for a month or something, it's just kind of rare to be able to do that. You have to have a pretty flexible employer. And when you do leave for an extended period of time, no one else is going to be doing your work for you. Something I really loved about New Zealand and ads that I had seen quite frequently on job sites was that if someone goes away for like a month or two to travel, that company is going to hire someone temporarily to cover that person's position. This is incredible. I wish North America would adopt this as like a regular practice, because getting out and seeing the world and using your vacation time is a right that you should have, and you shouldn't feel shamed by doing so, by actually taking that time off. There's also this really weird thing. If you're salaried, if you're on a salary in a, normal office job type of setting, you're kind of expected to do unpaid overtime. So there are laws in every province and across the entire country that say that, you can work up to a certain amount of time, regardless if you're salaried or hourly. But so many people I've met throughout my life work, 45 to 50 hours a week on a salaried position and are not getting compensated whatsoever for it. And the employer knows that they're not supposed to do that. They know that that's illegal. It's super illegal. It's unpaid work. But so many people do it. It's such a social norm that you're gonna find, if you have like a normal office job type of situation, that you might be expected to work like past normal hours. And if you don't, you're gonna be looked at like you're not doing enough. I think this is the silliest thing about the work ethic in this country and in America as well, is that if you're done on time, like if you leave the office every day at the same time, that you're seen as like lazy, even though it really just means that you're efficient. You can do your work in the allotted amount of time, and the people who are staying later, they're not that efficient, and they shouldn't be rewarded for that by people looking at them thinking like, oh, they're the hardest worker. They're here first in the morning and they leave last at night. It's just not an efficient way to work. So that is something that is a huge downside to living here, especially if you're from a country where it's not like that. If you're from somewhere where they actually encourage you to take your vacation, take your time off, take your sick days, take time to rest. It's not like that here. You're gonna be pressured to be at work as much as possible, and you're gonna be expected to put work over other things in your life. It's not nice. It's really not nice coming back to Canada after living in New Zealand. I have noticed it more now than ever before, how incredibly toxic it is. It's ingrained in me. I can't not behave that way. So it's just something I wanted to mention because I think it is not a good way to live. And it's definitely a reason why I would not move to Canada. The fourth item on this list is materialism. I have touched on this in various other videos, but Canada is in North America. It's a very consumerist, materialistic society. You're going to be judged on the type of clothes you wear, on the type of vehicle you drive, what kind of house you own, what kind of apartment you live in, what your home decor looks like, what kind of animal you have and the things that you buy for it, and just everything material. You're going to be judged on that. If you have an older phone or you have an older car, you're kind of looked at like you're not keeping up with people, and maybe you don't have as much money, which is wild to me because usually that's a sign that you're really good with money. Like if you have an older phone, older clothing that are in good quality and you've repaired them and you wear them a lot, and you have the same car, like that usually means that you're good with money and you probably have built up a bit of wealth. Not that you're poor, but the whole, showing wealth versus having wealth is another debate for another time. But living in Canada, it just really feels like you're being judged on the things you own, and it's very much encouraged to shop and get the newest, latest thing. There's always new restaurants and bars and places to go check out and shows, and that adds up over time. And some circles, some friend circles, look down upon that if you're not going out and doing things frequently, if you're not hitting up the hottest new restaurant or getting into the hottest new club or something. It's of course dependent on what your friend circle is like. I just think it's a lot more common in Canada to be surrounded by people who want and expect this and are blowing their paychecks, going out every weekend, drinking and eating, and it just isn't the way that I like to live. So I think this is a really big downside to living in Canada. I have found that thrifting is becoming a lot more popular. This is amazing to me because thrifting hasn't always had the best reputation, but now it's cool and it's kind of like chic to go out and go thrifting, although it is still encouraged to find like the best possible brands at the thrift store, which are usually a little more expensive. So you're still getting judged like on the brand, but at least you're getting it for a cheaper price. I don't know. I think for me, it's more about quality over whatever brand it is. But being in a North American kind of culture, just being materialistic and buying things and consuming things is the norm. This is definitely a downside for me. And I think if I was coming from a country that didn't care so much about this, it would be like a pretty big culture shock. The fifth item on this list is ties to the United States of America. This might be a controversial one, but Canada sharing a pretty big border with the US. We are constantly bombarded on what's going on in their political sphere. The news, the media is just constantly being pushed at you living in Canada, and I kind of understand it. I mean, like I said, we share a border, and a lot of the politics and things like consumerist type of things, trends and everything do trickle down into Canada over time, like music and movies and stuff, and what's popular there does eventually become popular in Canada, or it does like right away. But I think it's a downside because we're just like so closely tied to them. I feel like we don't have fully our own identity. And a lot of people in Canada are kind of like obsessed with the US, with what's going on there. And I'm just like sick of hearing about it. I don't necessarily care that much about the US, and I don't want to know what's going on there. I don't live there. I'm not able to vote there. It's important to stay up to date with like world news and global news and everything, but we get so much US centric media. We don't see a lot of the global stuff. You kind of have to go out of your way and search for it because the majority of it is just based on what's going on in the US. And that I think is a downside. Also, this might be a weird one, but measurements in Canada are very confusing. If you're coming from like the UK or something where you're using like the metric system, the US uses the imperial system. We use like a mixture of both. It's super confusing. When we're talking about things like height, we're talking in feet and inches. A lot of businesses that have to measure things out, like for signage or any kind of like building related measurements, it's usually done in feet and inches when it should be done in like meters and centimeters. I work in the brewing industry. We measure everything in like milliliters and liters, thankfully. But when you're talking about like baking and like cups and imperial cups, and a lot of bars here use ounces instead of milliliters. So there's just like such a mixture of measurements that it can get very, very confusing. If you're really comfortable with like the metric system and you're coming to Canada thinking like, oh yeah, like it's Canada, they use metric, like kilometers and everything like that, but it's not that way. It's just not normal to use metric for everything. So you have to learn a bit of like the American measurement system, which again ties to the US. And I don't like that because I think the metric system is superior. It makes way more sense. But I've just been raised to talk about certain things like height in feet and inches in the American imperial way. So that is frustrating. There's just so much that the US does that we kind of feel like we have to be a part of. And I think it's a downside. I mean, America doesn't have the best reputation, especially right now. So it's not that fun to be, you know, the northern little brother to the US. And I think that it is a big downside, especially the way that America treats like immigrants and immigration. And Canada, like a lot of people in Canada sort of adopting that mentality. I just think it's not great. It's not the best scenario. And again, if I was considering like moving to Canada from another country, this would be a huge downside, especially if I was not white. I think that Canada is a lot further along when it comes to like racist issues, but there's still so much work we need to do. And being so tied up with the US, I think we are also regressing a little bit in the way that we view the world. So this is a downside for me, definitely. Number 6 on this list is tipping culture. You guys have heard me mention this before. I absolutely hate tipping culture in this country. It is out of control. It is super frustrating. And it is 100% a huge reason that I would not want to live here long term. In Canada, it's almost always table service, which means, you go into a restaurant, someone seats you, a server comes, takes your order, they go get the food, bring it back, and you have this like long, lengthy interaction with having to wait for a server to come and serve you. When I lived in New Zealand, almost every place had bar service. So you go in, look at the menu, order at the bar, take a number usually, like a little stick with a number on top, go find a seat, and then they'll bring you the food or the drinks whenever it's ready. Sometimes if it's the bar and you're just getting a drink, you walk up, you buy a drink, you get it, and you sit down. So there's no like lag in between getting served. You're getting served immediately. Where here, if you go into a place and you're just looking for a drink, sometimes, you have to be seated by someone. You have to wait for the server to come and ask you what you want. Sometimes it takes like 5 to 10 minutes. Then you order it. Then maybe 5 to 10 minutes later, you get that drink. And then when you're ready to leave, you have to find the server if they're not like constantly checking up on you. It's a whole charade, honestly. And I am so done with it. And then at the end of all of that interaction where you're waiting and waiting and waiting, when you could have just went up and grabbed whatever drink you wanted or ordered your food or something, you have to tip a minimum 18 to 20% because that is the reality of what's going on right now. At least in Calgary, when you get the machine to pay, the automatic tip options are starting at 18% now. Doesn't matter that all of the prices on these menus has gone up over the last year or two, you are still expected to pay even more than the baseline, which was 15% for like the majority of my life. Always 15% was like the bare minimum. And you tipped more if the service was like incredibly good. And I think it just makes people a little bit lazy because it's this social norm that you have to tip. Even if you're walking up to a bar and someone is cracking open a can, they are expecting you to tip. And that 18% minimum is gonna come up. Every single cafe you go into, go and grab a coffee and like a baked good. You don't even sit down, you're grabbing it to go. The tip option is gonna come up and it's probably gonna be 18% minimum. So this to me is just ridiculous. It's totally out of control. I absolutely hate it. I have a rule now where if I'm not sitting down and being served, I am not tipping. No exceptions. If I'm going into a bar and I'm grabbing a drink and someone cracks open a can, you're not getting a tip. If I'm going to a nicer restaurant and I'm sitting down, someone's explaining the menu to me and then giving amazing service and bringing me food, absolutely, they're gonna get 18 to 20% because I feel like that's fair. But it's just crazy what types of establishments now are expecting you to tip. I don't think we're far away from like grocery stores, honestly, and gas stations like asking for tips. This is how crazy it's gotten. And it's not okay. If you're coming from a country where tipping is not a thing, this is gonna be a really harsh adjustment because you just have to add 15 to 20% onto your bill every single time you go out. It's a huge deterrent to going out in general, going out to eat or have a drink. I hate it. I don't wanna go on because I could rant about this forever. But it sucks, it's getting worse, and it's a reason to not move here. Number 7 on this list is healthcare. So I'm not an expert on this. I just have read a few articles and have my own experience. But over the last few years, the healthcare system in Canada has not been doing so great. I did touch on this in my New Zealand video as well, because New Zealand has privatized healthcare as well as public healthcare, and their public healthcare sector is doing very poorly, super long wait times and everything. So Canada only has public healthcare. So the wait times are very, very long. It can take months and months and months to get a referral to get some kind of scan if you need that, or some kind of blood work. If you're dealing with something that isn't like imminent, you're going to die very soon. And that's a huge downside. Yes, it's nice that healthcare is free. And if you're coming from a country like the US where it's not free, this would be much better for you. But if you're coming from maybe a European country or somewhere like New Zealand or the UK, then I think you're going to be a little disappointed in how good our healthcare system is. I've heard it can be very difficult to find a family doctor. For me, I always go to walk-in clinics, and it's great that we have that option. And I also don't have health issues. I have, just like the regular checkups. I'm really lucky in that way that I don't have to deal with the healthcare system here. But I know specifically in Alberta, there's been a lot of budget cuts in the healthcare sector, which of course is never good. So with all the immigration in the last year, it's just gonna get worse and worse. There's way too many people, and there are cuts in the healthcare industry. So that is not gonna level out. It's only gonna get worse. So that's something I would definitely take into consideration. If you need something like prescriptions, those are not covered at all. So you do have to rely on having some kind of work plan or privatized healthcare insurance plan to cover things like that, including dental. Dental is not covered by the government at all. I think there is something newer that's come into play in the last year or two where the government will cover certain things. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this. For me, I've always paid out of pocket for dental. Usually if you have some kind of work plan, I've never paid more than $60 a month, and that's for 80% coverage. So if you go to the dentist and your bill is like $100, it'll cover 80% of that. You'll pay 20 out of pocket. Same thing with prescriptions, 80% coverage, and that does help a lot. It goes a long way. So it's just something to note, because yes, Canada has free healthcare, but things like dental work, prescriptions, eye care, all of that is extra and out of pocket. And if you don't have a plan through work, I think it's quite a bit more expensive to go with private insurance. But it is something to note, because I don't think a lot of people know that. The last item on this list, number 8, is how far apart everything is in Canada, and that ties into public transit. Canada is a massive, massive country, second largest country in the world, and it is wildly expensive to travel within it. You would think it would be a little more affordable, but we just have so few airlines, not enough competition, and prices to get to and from places that are only an hour away can be $500 to $1,000. It's really not great if you have family or friends in other parts of the country. So I'm from Ottawa, I have family back in Ottawa. Usually if I'm paying under $500 round trip, that's really good. And it is a longer flight, it's 4 hours, but still, I would go home much more frequently if it wasn't that expensive. I work with a few people who have family that are across the country in smaller towns, and it just costs them thousands of dollars to fly home for Christmas or for any kind of holiday. It's wild. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to be moving here as a family, or you're going to move here and move around a little bit. It is not cheap to go in between each city. Sometimes you can find deals and seat sales, but a lot of the Canadian airlines are now doing this thing where you cannot bring carry-on luggage without it being $100 extra per way. So $200 round trip. Where it used to be the carry-on was free, and now it's just the personal item. So it's getting worse, and it's getting really, really frustrating. I mean, these airlines go on strike, it seems like every few months. Most cities and places in Canada, you're going to need a vehicle. I mean, especially in a city like Calgary or Edmonton. Toronto and Vancouver, they probably have much better transit systems than Calgary does, as well as Montreal. But specifically, the transit in Calgary is absolutely horrendous if you're considering moving here. The C train is constantly down, and it's dangerous. There's always stabbings and crazy crap going on C trains. The bus system is horrible. The buses are always late, and they're so rickety and loud, and I will walk 40 minutes to avoid taking the bus, and the bus is only 5 minutes quicker than it would be for me to walk to work. So the routes are just silly. They don't make any sense. The buses, the trains are always absolutely packed full with people. You usually have to wait for a second train or bus to come if you're traveling at peak hours. And again, with so many people moving to Calgary in the last year, this has exacerbated the problem like crazy. And I don't know, if anyone watching this video is from Toronto or Vancouver, has lived there, I'm sure you can say that those transit systems and public transit ways of getting around are much better than somewhere like Calgary, but it is something to note. I think if you're going to be living outside of a city like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, you're going to have a vehicle. And again, if you're an immigrant, your insurance rates are going to be through the roof, and buying a vehicle is not cheap. I mean, the used car market is still pretty high, so yeah, it's a downside for sure. Another thing with public transit is it's just difficult to get around a city in a Canadian winter, no matter where you are, maybe except for Vancouver, but every other Canadian city is gonna have pretty extreme temperatures down to minus 40 degrees. And that is not really warm enough to walk around or to be outside and commuting for an hour when a drive would have taken you like 10 minutes. And that is the reality of it in Calgary. If you're a 10 or 15 minute drive from somewhere, it can take you an hour to get there on the bus. And doing that in negative 40, it's just not realistic. I will also mention that a transit pass, at least in my city, is $115 a month. That's not that cheap. I mean, that's just about as much as I would pay in insurance. If you're an immigrant and you're going to move here, I mean, obviously that's gonna be much cheaper than what you would pay in insurance. But like I said before, the transit system, at least in Calgary, is horrendous, and it takes so much more time to get anywhere. So if you're going to consider moving to Canada and, Calgary specifically, or Alberta, definitely budget to have a vehicle and to be paying a lot of money in insurance. So some final thoughts for you guys after all of these points. It's not as attractive to move to Canada as it used to be, even just like a few years ago. I think a lot of our systems, our healthcare systems, our public transit systems are all at capacity or over with how much immigration has happened in the last few years. And I'm not against immigration. I love immigration. I think people moving from other countries into this country makes our country more interesting, but we just haven't built the infrastructure to support it. We don't have the housing, we don't have the road infrastructure or the public transit or all of these things. We're just struggling to keep up. And I think that's a huge thing for the government going forward to deal with, is to be more prepared for this kind of thing. I want people to move to Canada. I think it's an amazing country despite all of these things that I mentioned. There are so many good points. I mean, it's a beautiful country. The people are super friendly, and it is more affordable than a lot of other places in the world. So it's not the worst place to be. It's just that we need to be better as a country at supporting growth. Of course, I have to mention again, the winter, it's a struggle every year. A lot of people go into some pretty severe depression. And I'm not talking just like, ooh, I'm sad, it's dark out, like clinical depression, seasonal depression through the winter. It does suck. And adding on top of that, the consumerist, materialistic mentality, there are a lot of downsides. And I honestly think if I was not born in Canada, it would not be at the top of my list. There's just a lot of downsides right now. Maybe it'll get better. Maybe prices will come down. Things will get more affordable. The transit system will get better. The housing crisis will calm down. I think you really have to have something bringing you here. Maybe it's a really good job or family. Other than that, like, I would keep looking. I'm sorry, the winters can be so brutal. Like, specifically in Calgary, 6 months of winter, that's not fun. Yeah, so I hope you learned something from watching this video. If you have any thoughts on this topic, leave me a comment down below. I look forward to reading all of your thoughts, and I'll see you guys really soon in the next video. Bye.